How old are you exactly?
14.
Seems to us a pretty fabulous salary. How do you spend it?
Candy. Candy.
Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, Harlem, New York, active since 1954. It's the most dangerous kind of fame, the kind that finds you when you're too young to understand its price. When Frankie Lymon first stepped onto the stage with his boyish smile, wide eyes, and a voice that soared like it was touched by heaven, he wasn't just a rising star, he was a phenomenon. At just 13 years old, he wasn't just singing about love, he was redefining it. Why Do Fools Fall in Love became an anthem of innocence, but the reality behind that voice was far from pure. Behind the sweet melodies of the crowd's adoration, Frankie Lymon was a child lost in a world that swallowed him whole. With the teenagers behind him, Frankie became the first black teenage idol, an icon for an era that wasn't ready to see someone like him at the top. He was the blueprint for something that would become a formula in the industry, a group fronted by a young, charismatic lead singer who could capture the heart of millions. Over a decade later, this model would be perfected by Motown with the Jackson 5, where another young boy named Michael Jackson would captivate the world in almost the same way. But where Michael's rise was carefully managed and protected, Frankie's was a chaotic freefall. Fame acted as a cage. He was a child playing a man's game, controlled by managers who saw him as a product, surrounded by temptations he was too young to resist. Money that should have been his never reached his pockets. His fame quickly became a double-edged sword, trapping him in a world where love was just another lyric. But nothing falls faster than a star with nowhere to land. As Frankie grew older, his charm lost spark. His voice, once described as angelic, began to fade. His connection with the teenagers fractured, and his solo career never captured the same magic. Left in a world that only wanted his youth, he turned to the only comfort he knew: drugs, leaving him a tragic figure haunted by the shadow of his own success. By the time he was 25, Frankie Lymon was already a ghost, a name remembered more for what could have been than what he was. His death was lonely, a young star who lived fast, burned out faster, and left behind a story of innocence stolen and brilliance wasted. This is the story of Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, how the group that was supposed to change music fell apart, and how their shining star was extinguished before he ever really got to live. What happened? Let's talk about it. Salute to MP Pharaoh on YouTube for this request. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth Music. Let's get it, man. Take a minute to like, subscribe, and comment on who I should do next. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers were formed in Harlem, New York in 1955, a group of 5 young boys brought together by their love for harmony. Originally known as the Premiers, they found their voice when 13-year-old Frankie Lymon joined, transforming them into a sensation almost overnight. Their breakout single, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, released in 1956, became a worldwide hit, reaching the top of the charts and making Frankie Lymon the first black teenage heartthrob in America. Under the management of George Goldner, the group toured extensively, performing for racially mixed audiences at a time when segregation was still a painful reality. But success came with a cost. Goldner and the label prioritized Frankie as the lead, creating tensions within the group. The Teenagers felt sidelined while Frankie was thrust into the world of fame, exploitation, and temptation far beyond his years, a world that would eventually consume him. Stunt number 1, a star without protection. For Frankie Lymon, success came faster than he could understand it. At just 13 years old, his voice turned him into a sensation, but his age made him vulnerable. Frankie wasn't just the star of the Teenagers, he was the product. The group was pushed into relentless touring, endless promotional appearances, and recording sessions. But while the crowds adored him, behind the scenes, Frankie was just a child with no true guardian looking out for his well-being. The label saw his boyish charm as a marketing tool, and they exploited it to the fullest. Frankie's image was everywhere, but the money, it wasn't reaching him. Contracts were being signed off on his behalf, and like many black artists of the era, he was being taken advantage of financially. The Teenagers themselves began to resent Frankie, feeling like background players in their own group, as Frankie was given all the attention. The more he was exposed to the darker sides of fame, drugs, alcohol, and relationships far beyond his understanding. At an age where he should have been protected, he was left to navigate a world designed for his demise. He began experimenting with heroin as a teenager, a decision that would eventually alter his life. In contrast, Michael Jackson with the Jackson 5, but where Michael was shielded by Motown's carefully managed image and the watchful eye of his family, Frankie was left on his own. By the time he realized what he was losing, it was already too late. Frankie Lymon was a voice for the innocent, but he lived his life without it, pushed into the world too soon and left to find his own way through the darkness. Stunt number 2, the group that became a solo act. For a group named Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, the balance was already broken from the start. Though they began as a collective of 5, the moment Frankie's voice made them a sensation, the industry only saw one star, Frankie himself. And that's where the seeds of destruction were planted. What should have been a group of talented young singers became a one-man show where Frankie was elevated while the rest were sidelined. Their breakout single, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, was a massive hit, but it wasn't just a hit, it was a signal to the label that Frankie was the marketable face. Managers began promoting him as a solo act, even while the group toured together. The Teenagers, who once felt like brothers in harmony, felt like they were glorified afterthoughts. Tensions grew louder and resentment simmered. By 1957, just a year after their debut, Frankie Lymon officially went solo. But instead of the freedom he may have imagined, he found himself struggling without the chemistry that made the Teenagers special. The label forced him into recording bubblegum pop songs meant to appeal to his young fan base, but as he grew older, that image became harder to maintain. The voice that once soared began to waver. His charisma lost its innocence. Meanwhile, the Teenagers tried to continue without Frankie, but they were seen as a shadow of their former selves, famous for a song they no longer had the voice to perform. Both sides became weaker in their separation. What should have been a platform for group success became a curse. Frankie was left trying to figure himself out without the group's support, while the Teenagers were left trying to reclaim an identity that had already slipped away. That split was meant to make Frankie a superstar, but instead it marked the beginning of his decline. He lost the foundation that gave him strength, and with it, the support that could have saved his life. Stunt number 3, addiction and a lonely fall. Fame found Frankie Lymon too young, and by the time he realized its dangers, it was already a trap he couldn't escape. Separated from the Teenagers, pushed into a solo career that never matched his early success, and exploited by a music industry that saw him as a product rather than a person, Frankie was left with nothing but the pressures of trying to reclaim his fading stardom. But instead of finding his way back, he fell deeper into a darkness that had been following him since his teenage years. While Frankie's life spiraled into addiction, the Teenagers struggled without him. Left without their star voice, they attempted to replace Frankie with new lead singers, including Billy Labrano and later Howard Kenny Bobo. But the magic was gone. Audiences saw them as a broken version of the group they once loved, and their attempts to maintain relevance fell flat. Their records failed to chart, and they were soon relegated to a nostalgia act, living in the shadow of their past. Meanwhile, Frankie was becoming a tragic symbol of a wasted talent. What started as an escape became a chain around his life. As his voice weakened and his popularity waned, addiction took over. His record sales plummeted, his stage presence became unreliable, and his once sparkling image was replaced with scandal and whispers. A star who had once been America's sweetheart was now being whispered about for all the wrong reasons. Frankie's life became a series of failed comebacks, while the Teenagers were trapped in obscurity. On February 27, 1968, at just 25 years old, Frankie Lymon was found dead from a heroin overdose in his grandmother's bathroom, alone, broke, and forgotten. The Teenagers survived, but as a shell of what they once were, proof that when they lost Frankie, they lost their future too. All in all, Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers were a spark that should have ignited a lasting flame in music history. Instead, they became a tragic lesson in how fame without protection is a slow poison. Frankie Lymon's voice captured hearts worldwide, but his youth made him vulnerable to exploitation, addiction, and isolation. The Teenagers, left without their star, struggled to maintain relevance, becoming a ghost of the group they once were. Frankie's life ended at just 25, a fading star who once lit up the world but was consumed by his own darkness. The Teenagers continued in name, but the magic was gone. Together, they were sensational. Apart, they were lost. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers didn't just fall, they were never given a chance to stand. Salute, much respect, but for these reasons, their growth was stunted. It's your boy JC, Stunted Growth Music, and I'm out.